Gurmaig as Chocolate Shop Mountain and you, sponsor of Andina and Shop. You're all very welcome here this morning. Just a little bits of introduction first, if that's okay. First of all, everybody's very welcome to Maynooth University. Those of you online and those of you here present. We're in the middle of our celebration of Research Week this week, and the Research and Development Office organise this every year as a way to showcase the research that's underway here, both for internal audiences and external audiences. And this is part of that series of seminars and sessions that are on this week, and it's great to be part of that. And as well as that, it's the third in a group of 5 this term in a series of seminar series that myself and Seán is my name, and Professor Boyle beside me here are putting on. And the focus of these really is to try and get behind and understand the interaction between researchers and policymakers, and to talk a little bit about what they're doing or what they have done, but also to understand how they have worked together and what the lessons are, so people can reflect on that more broadly. And in particular, there's a particular scheme that Research Ireland, Táid Éireann, have in place, formerly known as Science Foundation Ireland, and we have people from Research Ireland here today, which is great. Put a scheme in place so that academics could be seconded into government departments, and we have a really good example of that today for somebody who's currently seconded in, and we have another one in 3 weeks' time as well. So it's great that we're able to showcase and learn from work that's currently underway, and to see where that's at, and to see how that work is progressing. So we are really thrilled to be joined by Professor Louise Connell here, and she's a Professorial Research Fellow in the Department of Psychology here, but she's seconded to the Department of Public Expenditure, NDP Delivery and Reform at the moment, and under this Public Service Fellowship scheme. And from that department, we're joined by Claire Doyle, and you're very welcome, Claire. You're very welcome to Maynooth. And so they're going to jointly present about their work together, and the work together is about how behavioural science can be utilised in the public sector to tackle environmental challenges and improve policy making. So they're going to talk for a while, and then we're just going to have a bit of a conversation. And what we're going to do in terms of, we're going to be able to take comments and questions here in person, but also we'll be looking at the chat online, and we can take from that, and we'll feed any comments and questions back in. So Foster and Virchogo, you're both very welcome, and over to you.
Great, yeah. So I'm going to start and give a little bit of context from before Louise joined us. So yeah, as Seán said, my name is Claire Doyle. I work in Department of Public Expenditure, NDP Delivery and Reform. So I work on the transformation division. So just a little bit of context about our work. So we're very much driven by our Better Public Services strategy, which was published last year, but it sets out the transformation agenda and strategy up to 2030 for the civil and public service. So it's built around 3 different pillars. The first one is about digital and innovation at scale. And the second one is about workforce and organisation of the future, so building up capabilities. And then the third one, which is really where, the focus of a lot of my work, which is evidence-informed policy and services designed for and with our public. So this is all about improving policymaking, embedding new tools into policymaking, delivering human-centered policymaking that is evidence-informed, data-based. There's a lot of things that fall under it, but so my work really is to look at different tools to improve policymaking, and a lot of that work has been influenced by this report from the OECD, which was done a number of years ago about strengthening policy development in the public sector in Ireland. So the OECD came in and they took a look at the policymaking process and came up with a number of different recommendations, and then pointed to a number of different limitations or weaknesses within the policymaking sector in Ireland. So they pointed to a number of different tools where policymakers themselves had stated that they felt that their skills weren't appropriate to be using these new tools in policymaking. So a few things that they had pointed out were behavioural insights, systems thinking, strategic foresight, and a few others around, I think, kind of design thinking and qualitative analysis. So I guess my role and the role of our team in part is to look at those tools and to test and to see whether there is something we can do to try to improve the capabilities within policymaking, and can we embed those policy methods more into policymaking. So that sets up a little bit of why we needed to look into behavioural insights. Sorry, before we get into that. So kind of what I already said here, but so we're investigating innovative policy methods. We're trying to support policymakers to embed these methods into the policymaking process, and then create and maintain networks. And so we're trying to do this in 3 ways. We're first kind of assessing the evidence base underpinning these policy methods. We want to build capacity in those methods, and then we want to test it to see if it's actually useful for policymakers. So this is the context of where we're trying to get to, I guess, with behavioural insights. So we know the policymakers have stated that they don't necessarily feel that they have the skills to use behavioural insights in their everyday work or in policymaking. So first, what we wanted to do is really test that theory and test whether behavioural insights are useful in policymaking, and where there has been demonstration of that in Irish policymaking. Just a little bit about the department's relationship with research institutions. So a bit of just to state here, I've only been in the department for a year, so others might disagree with me on this, but my background is that I've worked in Department of Health, I worked in the Oireachtas, so I've worked in other organisations where there's maybe been more formal links to research institutions, and there's been more focus on, you know, building up research relationships and kind of ongoing research projects with different institutions or different bodies. My experience in the department so far is that there is less of those formal links. There's not necessarily a dedicated research unit, and there's not the same relationships, I guess, formal relationships between different organizations. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. We are a central government department, so while we do deliver some policy in terms of expenditure policy, in terms of pay policy, in terms of, you know, NDP delivery, we're a little bit stepped away from some of those other policy areas. So there would be a relationship between policy departments and their relationships with research institutions, but we're just a little bit stepped behind. And another reason for it is that we have the Centre of the Irish Government Economics and Evaluation Service, which some of you are probably aware of. So this is a group of economists and policy analysts that are hired into the civil service. They're kind of managed centrally through our department and distributed around the system. So there's actually a lot of built-in research capability through this service. And there's a lot of research capability built into a lot of the different units in the department. So again, maybe that's one of the reasons that we don't have the need necessarily to have those formal links. And again, maybe there's more need for modeling capabilities rather than kind of research for policy, how we would normally think of research for policy. So sorry, that brings me on to this project. So a little bit of a strangeness, I guess, about this project is that the research proposal was written before I started, and it was written before my boss started, and it was written before anyone involved in the ongoing project was there, and it was written by someone who left before we joined. So couldn't talk to the person, didn't know, I actually don't even know who the person is. Couldn't talk to them about the rationale, about where the kind of parameters were coming from. However, I was thrilled that someone had took the initiative to reach out and ask for a researcher, because I said, that'd be great. It would be great if we could have a researcher for a year. But for this reason, the proposal itself was very broad. Yeah, it was written by a past colleague. It has an environmental focus, which probably there was a rationale for the person who wrote it, but for me, there is a rationale for an environmental focus, but also needs to be a little bit broader as well. The objectives and the output were not well defined, in my opinion, and not necessarily well defined for the purpose of what I wanted this project to achieve. So this made me a little nervous about bringing on a researcher or someone they'd have to put shape on the project, and they would have to work with us in terms of kind of developing it a little bit as we go. So I guess that was a little bit of trepidation on my part before someone joined, because I was aware that there were some issues with the project that needed to be dealt with. And then to Louise.
So yeah, before I found out about all of this, I had heard about the SFIs, it was at the time, the Public Service Fellowship Scheme, that came along at a really good time for me, because I was finishing up basically a 6-year ERC grant, and I kind of wanted a palate cleanser, and this looked like a really good way of doing it. And my main research area isn't in applied work, it isn't in policy work, it isn't in behavioural science per se. I'm in the Department of Psychology, and I do work on thinking and language, basically. But I'm also a methodologist, and I teach in this area, so I was quite familiar with it, but I had an outsider's perspective on it. And I quite liked the idea of being able to come in, to parachute in as an outsider and deal with a topic that I knew my way around, but it didn't have any, research repercussions for me, so to speak, if it turned out to be not the best fit. But as it turned out, it worked really well. I was perfectly happy to come in where the project wasn't pinned down, because I was coming in at quite a senior level, and I like my autonomy, and I like being able to kind of co-create what the project spec ended up being. And we were able to, within pretty quickly, pin down a broader focus of what I thought was going to be achievable in the time, specific objectives and outputs that I thought were workable. And kind of because of the nature of what it was, I wasn't too pushed about getting a research publication out of it. I had a stack of data from the project I'd finished that was begging to be written up anyway. So I was happy for the output to be an internal facing report that didn't have to go through 11 million layers of clearing to face the outside world. And I think it was easier for us to sort of sit down and agree kind of what the project spec was going to be together, because I was used to putting together projects. Like I went up to Claire, but a couple of days in, I think I shocked her slightly with here's 3 different ways we can do it. I prefer this one, but here's all the reasons, the pros and cons. Yeah. And we agreed a way that we were all happy with. And as we kind of started working through it then, I was happy with the level of autonomy that I had. Claire was happy with the check-ins, I guess, and eventually just sort of left me to go do it. It was fine. So what we actually ended up doing then was we broadened the focus away from just environmental stuff, because we wanted to find out whether behavioural insights was actually useful in a very kind of concrete way. Where were the success stories across the civil service or across public bodies where people had been using these techniques to inform policy and they had followed through. And Claire had done some preparatory work, and it looked like there were lots of pockets of research going on all over the place, but we didn't know what the details were. So we went and gathered together eventually. I think there's probably about a dozen areas in total, but we pinned it down to 7 where we could actually get hold of enough information to take a deep look. So we stuck with the environmental focus as well, because it is quite an important area within behavioural science. And we looked at that from 2 different areas. So we've got SEAI's work, and also the National Transport Authority were doing some work in that area too. There were different projects going on in health, some of them being worked by researchers in health itself, and others that were being commissioned off to the ESRI. The ESRI pops up over and over and over again when you start looking at behavioural work in Ireland, because they've had a behavioural science unit there for a number of years. But as well as kind of health and environment and financial stuff, there was work had been done in revenue years ago. There's other work for the Competition Consumer Protection Commission, ESRI had done. We also found some interesting kind of social applications of it from the National Disability Authority. They had got some work done there, trying to examine attitudes on disability and how difficult it is to measure that accurately. So it was really, really diverse. That was kind of the nice thing for me coming into it. It wasn't just people running nudge stuff over and over again, which I had been slightly afraid of. It was very, very broad. People were using it kind of at all stages of the policy cycle, commissioning reviews to kind of, in the early stages, to think about, are there any behavioural factors we actually need to think about here before we get into the weeds of what the specifics of a policy might be? And in some cases, the answer from researchers came back is like, no, there's actually not enough evidence here at all to warrant taking behavioural factors into account, but come back in 5 years, maybe somebody will have done the work then. But most of the time, yes, there was quite a lot of international work there that could have been done. So for each of these areas, what we basically ended up doing was getting hold of the reports that have been written up. Lots of the places had data sets up, so I spent a lot of time looking through data, which keeps me happy, and reading reports and figuring out exactly what they had done. And of course, then going to talk to the people who had done this to find out what really happened. And everybody was very just happy to talk to us. We weren't sure whether that was going to be the case, but there was an enormous amount of goodwill there, and people were quite happy to give us some time to talk through what motivated it, what impact some of the work had had to date. And a lot of this work was still ongoing, so the impacts hadn't been fully kind of mapped out yet. But overall, it was quite good. The only people we couldn't talk to were revenue, because the work had been done about 10 plus years ago. The people had moved on since. The people who were there at the moment hadn't been involved in it and didn't really know anything about it. So I was relying just on the written reports there. So I'm a big fan of people who document things, which is not always the case. So this has kept me busy for the last while. In each of these areas, I look at what's done. I look at whether I think it was done well. Was there anything missed? Were there any issues that they found that maybe could have been avoided? And then, did it seem to have an impact? Was it used in the end for some kind of policy decision? And it's still ongoing, no findings yet. But from academic point of view, I've had a lot of interest from other academics and other researchers going, oh, that fellowship sounds interesting. And one of the first things they always ask about is it a bit of a culture shock going into the civil service? And in some ways, depending who I'm talking to, I can say it is. It's much more hierarchical. Academia is not massively hierarchical. It tends to be full of people who don't like working in hierarchies. And there's certainly more layers of sign-off and reporting and all of this kind of thing. And generally, things are cautious. But none of that is a surprise, really. It's kind of as I was expecting it to be. I've spent a little bit of time in the corporate sector before I ran away from it. So it reminds me very much how I tend to frame it to people is that it's like having a corporate structure, but with a public sector budget and speed of operation. So with that mindset, there's very few surprises in place. And just like academia, you work with people, you collaborate, and you are as flexible as you need to be because things change. But when we kind of get into the weeds of the work, I've had to readjust some of my concepts of what qualifies as evidence. It's very different when it's research for policy, I have found, compared to scientific research, where I'd be coming from. So being able to kind of recalibrate what a threshold of evidence should be when a piece of work is potentially informing policy versus when a piece of work is telling you some fundamental truth about the universe, different things. I have found there's less transparency generally, and work can get lost very frustratingly in research for policy. given the timelines involved, there often just isn't enough time for the people to write everything up in massive amounts of detail. So when they move on, the work is, and the knowledge just disappears. That's beginning to change a bit. Some of the more recent projects are documenting things more. But as I mentioned, for revenue, we did lose a chunk of work, and because of that, because everybody had left. One thing that I have found as well, which is part of the project, which is to do with kind of evaluating work that has gone on elsewhere, is everybody's agreed from a policymaker point of view that yes, research evidence is great. We want evidence-informed policy, but there's not necessarily attention on whether the evidence is any good. And certainly in the international context, there can be a tendency to ignore the fact that just because you have found evidence that seems to support the direction you want to go in, it doesn't mean there isn't 10 times that amount of evidence of better quality pointing in the opposite direction. So part of what I've ended up doing is having to attend a lot more and convince people of why the quality of research matters. And this is particularly important in behavioural science for many reasons, but it's part of what has been the reproducibility crisis within psychology and all behavioural work, where a lot of the published research that's out there, it got published because it found something, and then there's a massive amount of unpublished research that found nothing or found the opposite, that remains unpublished, stuck in somebody's desk drawer. So there are ways you can counter this. There's ways you can evaluate it and work through it and try to figure out exactly what's going on. And there is an increasing need to do that within behavioural science. And I was very happy to see that certainly the more recent work that I've been looking at, there's great awareness of that, and there's much more attention on the quality of the research involved, not just the fact that there is some research going on. Back to Claire.
That's me. And then Louise had asked me if there was any culture shock on my end. I'd say not so much, considering I was still situated in where I was working, so much bigger culture shock for yourself, I would imagine. But some of the things that Louisa mentioned there about, you know, the difference between the quality of research, or how you define quality, was something that I was already aware of, and maybe a little nervous of an academic coming in and assessing policy work from an academic point of view, because they're not written to deliver the same thing. So critiquing policy papers from an academic you know, criterion, it's not going to be, it's just not necessarily going to be appropriate. So, and we're more interested in the message and communicating the findings than maybe detailing the methods. So that was something that I guess we had to discuss, and to discuss how to phrase that, or how to assess those kind of papers. And I guess another thing that I was a little nervous about at the beginning is that this project needed to, yes, assess the evidence base and to build the argument for either having more resources dedicated to embedding behavioural insights or not, if that was going to be the case. But it also was about building relationships. This was we're a new unit, it's a new body of work. As Louise said, we had to talk to a lot of different people about the work that they had done over the past decade. So we both needed to build the relationships with those people, because they're the ones who were actually doing behavioural insights, you know, using behavioural insights research in their work. So they're really important people for us going forward. So we had to build those relationships and also gain stakeholder buy-in. So both from the people who are really interested in behavioural insights and the skeptics, because we need to bring everyone along, I guess, and we need to actually assess whether this is something that we should look at going forward or not. So relationship management was a big part of this project. And we kind of discussed early on that while we both have a role to play, we needed to tackle that together, that, you know, we would I would maybe communicate some more of the policy messaging, and Louise would communicate more of the research, but having that kind of dual approach, we recognised each other's role and some of the benefits of me being a policy person and Louise being an academic. We could come at it at two different sides, which was useful. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, that there needed to be flexibility built in. Anyone who's worked on policy will know that it's ever changing, and the landscape is changing, and different stakeholders have different perspectives at different times. So you need to be a little bit flexible in terms of where the project is going. So we kind of built that into the scoping part of the project, saying that, you know, there are certain decision points that need to be built in, and we'll make decisions as we go, and potentially the project will change from there. And I guess for all those reasons, the relationship communication between us was key to really progressing this project. This wasn't a proposal written, Louise goes off and does it and then checks in 6 months. There was, at least at the beginning, there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of engaging with stakeholders together, a lot of discussing what to do next. And, you know, discussing those options and the pros and cons that Louise had mentioned. So yeah, that's just some takeaways from my perspective. And then I guess some takeaways in general for policymakers from this experience. Myself and Louise have now reflected, so they might not be the most developed takeaways, but at the moment, discuss expectations from the outset. I think that was really, really useful for both of us. Making it clear, you know, that this is my perspective. These are my worries as well. And discussing that with Louise, I think made a huge difference to our working relationship and the work that we are still delivering. Make the most of the academics experience. When Louise had those different options prepared, it really highlighted to me that, you know, she has all this expertise, and she's not just an additional resource. She's not just another person on the team. We have an SFI fellow in, we need to use that expertise. So that very much was kind of the deciding factor to me of which option to go for. It's the option that we can really squeeze as much insight from her, rather than something that I could, you know, get another a fellow colleague to do. So that's one thing, to really recognize that expertise and use it for the time that you have it for, and also embrace some of the benefits of having an independent, somewhat independent researcher. There are benefits that come with that in terms of being seconded into the department, but not being a fully fledged civil servant. So there's a certain amount of independence there, and that's very useful. And again, communicate the concerns, which I've already discussed.
Yeah, and just, I suppose, from the academic point of view, anybody who'd be thinking of doing something similar, I'd recommend it. I've had quite a good few months. But it's to go in, as well as what Claire had said, expect the goalposts to change a lot more than they would in the context of an academic research project, because it tends to have to be more responsive to other priorities and demands that might very suddenly land on you on a Friday evening, and you just deal with that. And because I'm not the most obvious kind of academic to go into this kind of work, I don't do policy work, so it's very much leaning on kind of my method background. It's to sort of say to academics, like, don't be afraid to go outside your comfort zone here. Your skill set applies a lot more widely than you might perhaps think from the outset. And I think it's actually been very useful, as I mentioned, to come in with a slight outsider's perspective to the exact area in question, because it lets me be a bit more objective. I don't have a pet theory or a predetermined notion of whether something should work or not. And that's been really useful in what we were doing. And I think Claire alluded to it already, but the interests are different. Approaching something from a research for policy standpoint compared to an academic standpoint, there are different requirements, different needs, a different timeline. Sometimes you just need to get on with it. That's good enough. make a decision and move on. And it's part of the flexibility, but to make sure that you're sculpting what you're delivering for the right audience. And if you bear that in mind, you'll have very few surprises once you get in.
Okay. Look, that was really interesting, and it's great. It's great to see. It's great to see the two of you working together, and it's really interesting to see that you're not doing what you applied to be doing, or what, and hearing the internal reason for that so openly, but actually probably doing something that does all the stuff that you would have done, but actually does a lot more. So that initial conversation, I was going to, before I open it up, and we'd open it up for online chat as well. Just to understand the Department of Public Expenditure, NDP Delivery and Reform, could you say a little bit about the role of your unit, Claire? Because we were chatting outside, and also the newness of the people, and if you like the mandate that you're working to.
Yeah, sure. So it really is around that strategy, the better public services. So the transformation division is kind of two different teams. One team is looking at the delivery of public services and how to improve the delivery of public services. So that's around greater digitalization, more innovative ways of delivering methods, having user-centered design. And then the unit that I'm working in is the policy unit. So it's public sector transformation policy. So we're really looking at how to embed new ways and better ways of kind of developing policy. So there's a few different elements to that. There's the promoting transparency and trust. So there's things like open data, open government, trying to get more participation, kind of improving public consultations is another bit, and providing tools for public consultations. And then there's also methods bit of it. So the different things that we're looking at the moment are embedding design principles and design thinking into policy making. We're investigating how we can promote behavioural insights, and whether there's a need to promote behavioural insights, which is where this project comes from. There's also strategic foresight, which is all about how to make policies forward-looking, and not just looking at the next kind of 5 years, looking at what are the trends out there and how can we make policy in a way that will meet those potential futures. And then systems thinking, which is about linking, focusing on interconnections and focusing on policy problems, and the different actors, I guess, that need to then link up to that policy problem, as opposed to looking at it from a siloed approach or from a departmental approach. So there's a lot of different areas to it, but overall we're trying to kind of promote trust, transparency, openness, human-centered policy delivery is it in a nutshell.
Yeah, and that public sector reform includes all public sector, all of the public sector, including, for example, the university sector. So
yes,
you have an oversight leadership board.
Yes, exactly.
Which
Yeah,
the Secretary General of the Department of Further and Higher Education, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it's funny because the first question we had actually was asking the same thing that I thought to ask first. I'm going to go right to the end now, and you've been very coy deliberately about saying like what the findings are. So I can't ask you what the findings are because I don't think that's fair. But can I ask you, have you an idea of the emerging findings, and are they of relevance? So have you an idea of the emerging findings, Louise and Claire? Have you an idea of the relevance of the emerging findings? So I know if you were in deeper and you were meeting the assistant secondary area, you'd have to say what the emerging findings were, but you're not going to declare them in public today. But so.
Yeah, so, well, I can say safely, one of the things that I found is that some of the most useful, or at least kind of some of the strongest examples of using behavioural insights are the ones that have happened quite early in the policy cycle, as I mentioned, where a review has been commissioned to actually just, can we please look at all of the different behavioural factors that might create barriers to people doing whatever it is we want to do, or that might motivate them differently to engaging with whatever it is in question. And with a review like that being done quite early on, it can come out with really clear recommendations. Well, that's a very strong steer that this should be done, this should be done, this should be done. Whether that is actually followed through then with policy, and who knows, but by kind of embedding it early like that, you get really clear steers about what's likely to matter and not, which makes it easier, I think, to take account of behavioural insights in general, compared to if it's just somebody testing a policy that's already about to be implemented and you're just like tweaking around the edges. So bringing it in earlier.
Embedded in the nature of the
embedding
policy.
it right from the
Okay,
start.
that's pretty clear. Yeah, that's a pretty clear finding.
That's
I think the useful thing as well about this process is that if you had gone down a more traditional tendering for research or setting up some kind of a research relationship, you probably wouldn't know any of the findings or any of the ongoing work until a first draft was delivered, and then it's a first draft, but it's in many ways it's kind of a completed document. There's only things you can tweak around the edges. However, as this has gone on, because we're so linked up with what we're doing, I do know some of the emerging findings, and that has been presented internally and has been discussed internally, and I can see where this end product might go and how it can help us to support policymakers to use behavioural insights. So it's useful from that perspective, because I can put certain things in place now, knowing that Louise still has 2 months left to work on it, but I have more of an insight about what the final product would be, which is very useful.
Right. So we're going to open it up. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Yeah. Hold on, we get this to you.
Sure, thanks. Seán Colgan from the Department of Tourism and other things. I suppose I had two different questions. One, I'd be interested in your reflection on kind of, we've used this word evidence quite a bit this morning. It's tricky at policy making to know exactly, if the things we've done are evidence or not. So, I guess we would often go out to an expert group and gather them together and hear from the views of the industry or the public or whatever, or we might do a public consultation. I'd be interested in your thoughts on where that fits and kind of, is that really good evidence or really bad evidence or somewhere in between? That will be interesting to me. The second one then, I was just curious about your reflections on how we can embed this into the government system. IJUS, do we turbocharge IJUS and we turn them into the behavioural science, consultancy for the government, or do you do something like the climate change system where there's kind of a climate officer in every department? And just, again, curious as to how you think this could be kind of further embedded, because I noticed people leave and then things collapse. And yeah, that's it. Two questions. Thanks.
Well, I can say something briefly on the evidence one, but I'm definitely passing the next one. In terms of evidence, it very much depends what the exact question is that's being asked. So, for example, in a public consultation, I'm hoping in tourism there mightn't be that many really, really controversial issues that you're trying to get at, compared to, for example, anything to do with climate change. And there's a good example of one of the pieces of work I was looking at was on disabilities. And how do you accurately measure the public's attitude towards disability or towards disability policy, when if it's done in kind of a traditional way of a phone survey by a market research company, people lie. There is a social desirability bias where they know what the expectation is of what they should be saying, and there's a person talking to them on the phone, they're going to deliver that instead of what their actual opinion would be. So they're part of the work that I was looking at there that was done by the ESRI for the National Disability Authority. They came at it in a completely different method, very different way of approaching it, getting people to provide their information anonymously online, approaching even how you ask the questions in a completely different way, so people don't necessarily realize you're probing their opinions on these kind of controversial things. And then the picture of the attitudes you get back from that are quite different in some ways. So that would be pretty solid evidence from the way it's been done. But more conventionally, because it's such a tricky issue, it would not be very good quality evidence coming back from the traditional survey approach. But it's having to take that really detailed look. It depends what the question is. It depends there's no one size fits all blanket response to whether an approach makes for good evidence or not. It depends on what the topic is it's trying to probe. So that's the complicated answer.
In terms of the kind of model, it's something that we're looking at, right? In terms of how do we embed behavioural insights? So I guess the first question is it already embedded? You know, do we actually need to take any actions on it? We're still, you know, gathering the evidence there. If we were to take more, you know, to have more behavioural insights experts in government, how would that look? There's a number of different options. We're looking internationally at the different models internationally. You know, I think the obvious one is in the UK, where they have the behavioural insights team that have been, you know, they were established maybe about 10, 15 years ago, and they're quite a large group of people, and they've been embedded in policy making and in the government for a number of years. We're a lot smaller than the UK. So, you know, they've done lots of considerations. We do have IJUST there, and a lot of the people within IJUST would have some training in behavioural economics, and some people would have more specialty in behavioural insights than others. There's a question of whether there needs to be dedicated resources in every department. At the moment, you know, there are dedicated resources in certain departments. Maybe that's enough. Maybe there needs to be more. I don't have an answer. These are all questions that we will be considering, and, you know, asking the people out there, asking the policymakers, you know, are there more dedicated resources that they need? I'm not saying that I can necessarily deliver that. I absolutely can't. But yeah, I don't have a good answer. But there's lots of potential opportunities and potential options to go down.
Right, thanks.
Can I just jump in? Seán has asked a similar kind of question on the takeaways of the long-term consequences or benefits of the scheme, and of course what you do with the report and where you take the findings of the report and how that's used moving forward as part of it. But also part of it is this is a funded scheme. You know, it's an experimental scheme in some ways. We've not really developed this kind of crossover. As you've gone through a process, that process has been quite, by the sounds of it, you know, it's been a huge learning process for all parties involved. Expectations haven't always, you know, it's not been pinned down clearly enough that it's just sailed through. You've had to continuously reinvent the project and get to know each other and work your way through challenges and so on. So the other thing about banking experience isn't only what you're going to do with the report, but what you're going to do with the capacity and experience that you've harvested. And are you going to bank that so that it doesn't evaporate after the year's finished? And if so, you know, how do we capitalise and learn from the process of doing this work, as well as the substantive research output?
It's a good question, and a question that, as Louise was kind of somewhat annoyed sometimes when there isn't the detailed outcomes and process in these papers. You know, we need to look at ourselves in that same light as well. So it's a good point. It's very handy that, I mean, Louise is only in Maynooth, so I'm hoping that she can, you know, come back and present on her work even after this SFI fellowship has finished. However, already a lot of the work and the process has led to relationship building and stakeholder buy-in. So at the moment, it's kind of a snowball effect a little bit, that we are capitalizing on the work as it goes. In terms of what we do with the output, there's I guess it kind of depends on what it looks like. However, we're hoping to gain these maybe generalized principles or key learnings from basically the past 10 years of the use of behavioural insights in policy, to hopefully both inform policymakers if they want to go down a road of using behavioural insights, hopefully we'll have some tips for them. We'll be able to identify these are some key people that have done really good work, and maybe you could talk to them. Some of them might be online and they might not want that, but I'll talk to them later. And then it really informs our next steps as well, in terms of this is going to be a key piece of research. Key findings from it will then inform what we do next, which at the moment we're not sure, because we're really relying on a number of different pieces of evidence to give us give us the mandate to say these things are needed, and that's why we're doing these. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a point there. Maybe we need to document it, but Louise will document it. But it is an ongoing process. So this is one step in a number of different steps to determine where we're going.
I don't have too much to add to that, other than, to have some kind of an ongoing link once the project ends. We will have some sort of a back and forth. I may nab Claire at some point to come in and give a guest lecture on teaching psychology students again. But we don't have anything formally to follow.
See, I think that's, I mean, I can understand where you're coming from. For me, not being the behavioural scientist, I mean, I'm really interested in the academic output, the substantive output, but more so from a policy process point of view. I'm interested in how to unlock academic expertise in the service of better public policy making, and there's tons and tons and tons of ways of doing it. This scheme is just one of those. And I think the funder will be gathering experiences at the end and pooling this. But our question is, it's labour intensive. It's quite heavy involved. It costs money. At some stage, is this the best way to invest in knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer? Are there other ways that are more efficient? It seems to me it's hugely beneficial and perhaps non-substitutable way of both sectors getting to know each other and working together. But in the context of other possible routeways and the context of ration time resources and finite financial resources and so on, is this kind of scheme one of the major ways to invest in order to realise some of the Impact 2030 agendas and so on. So the experience in banking it and pulling it across all of these 11 or 12 of the knowledge exchange, I think is going to be really exciting to see. We've got a question online, but maybe it goes back to the floor.
You go back actually on that very point to the floor. I'm actually going to ask Teresa Brophy, who's leading on this in Research Ireland, to just make a few comments maybe. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I'm Teresa Brophy. I manage the Public Service Fellowship at Research Ireland. So thank you very much for your presentation this morning. I think this really emphasises the co-creation in particular that you emphasised here about the project. I think that's really what we want to see here. And it seems like you've worked really closely together, and it'd be great to see that ongoing link. I might just have a quick question for Louise as well, in terms of we're funding the academic researchers going into government. In terms of your further research career and your teaching, do you think actually having this exposure to government departments is going to impact that in some way in the future?
Yeah, well, I mentioned already that this isn't my core research area. I was kind of looking at it more because it was an area that I was interested in but didn't have a grounding in. So it's kind of adding another string to my bow in research terms. I don't know yet. I may do more research work in this area. But it's definitely going to have an impact on the teaching end of things, because I already teach in this area. And now I'm pretty sure I could deliver an awful lot more on that end of things. But I always have project students who want to do more applied work, and kind of applied stuff, and behavioural insights is kind of a common interest for them. And I'm much better equipped to say yes to those kind of projects now compared to what I would have been previously. So it'll be, it will have a knock-on effect in teaching, certainly.
That's great. Thank you very much. And if anyone wants to talk to us about the fellowship scheme, I'm happy to chat to anyone after. So, thanks.
Can I just follow up? Jennifer Brennan online has asked a question. I know we spoke about it earlier on, Teresa, about the reverse scheme. This is mainly one way from your point of view of funding. There are some smaller transfers from the civil service into academia. And Jennifer's asking, is that do we need to stand up an equivalent scheme, and what would be the merits of actually the two-way traffic? I don't know if Claire wants to reflect on the
Yeah, I mean,
potential for yourself.
I think there's a huge, I think there'll probably be a big interest in it. So I've come into the civil service from the IGES stream, so from the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service. So from the people who go into that, I think some people are quite interested in applying research to policy. But you do find yourself getting very interested in these areas, but not having the time to do the research that you want to do. I spent then a little bit of time in the Parliamentary Budget Office, which does have more of a focus just on sole research. So it gave me a bit of time to deliver some of those kind of pet projects that I maybe didn't have a sponsor necessarily, but I just thought it would be really interesting and really useful to deliver. And I was given the time to do that. But there's not that many places within the civil service where you can do that, because it's fast moving, changing priorities. You have to, deliver quite quickly sometimes. So I do think there's probably a big demand for, if someone has an interesting question, they've identified the data, they've identified maybe a method to do it, and they don't necessarily want to deliver a whole PhD in order to answer the question that's been bugging them at night, really. Then yeah, absolutely, there might be, a year there where they could both learn from research institutions, learn from the colleagues around them within the academic sector, and to deliver something really interesting for policy.
Thanks, and thanks, Jennifer. Thanks.
Just to say, I forgot to say at the start, there will be an audio version of this available afterwards for anybody who wants to take obviously a couple of weeks to get that ready, but we're getting a question or two about that. Any more comments or questions from the room? Another fellow in Brian Donlan.
Thanks very much. Just a brief observation, really, rather than a question. Hugely impressive. Congratulations. Really great work. And I'm just blown away by the amount of collaboration going on in a very meaningful way. Two comments. Evidence. Sometimes I think there can be confusion around data and evidence. So whether policy is driven by data or driven by evidence, to me, it's completely different, actually. That evidence only becomes evidence after the data has been used. There's experience, there's intuition, there's wisdom applied to the data. So I think the distinction between data and evidence needs to be thought through, I think. The other point is that if you unpack the processes that you've been engaged in, it's quite sophisticated. I think, you have at least four or five sub-processes going on there. There's this the creation of the research activity, there's the capturing of the outputs, there's the application of that research internally and externally, there's the dissemination and the articulation of the project. So yeah, well, there is a question here, I guess. Those sub-processes and the overall schema for how this is managed, is there some thought given to that, or not? Maybe it's too early.
So sorry, has there been thought into the process?
So
delivering the output?
Yeah, so that there's great research being done by Louise. How that data is, that evidence is consumed and understood and absorbed, and whether the department has the absorptive capacity to subsume all that. And then, of course, it's not much good, or it's of limited use unless you actually use the research output. So how that will be used, and also the whole dissemination question, internal and external communication and dissemination. So is there an overall schema or model somewhere that understands those sub-processes, I guess?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I'll answer it in full, but you can tell me if I haven't. So I guess it's somewhat is determined by the output as I discussed, but at the same time there's been ongoing updates of which has been another very beneficial outcome of this relationship, is that, you know, Louise has been able to present on kind of ongoing work to senior stakeholders and to make them aware of the progress that's happening and not just the final report. So that's really useful, and people are very interested in that. At the same time, because we're working with a number of different experts doing, you know, using behavioral insights in a number of different fields, we're discussing with them as well about what the outcomes will be, and then the question then is how to communicate that, and how to use it and how to disseminate it. So that is the point of the project that we're in, maybe not now, but will be in the next month. So I guess we're currently looking at different potential avenues of communication, of first communicating it up into our internal streams, but then communicating it externally as well. It's quite useful in the transformation sector because we do have links to both kind of civil service wide, also public service wide. So we do have good communication links and you know, ways to communicate to quite a broad audience, but the capacity to take in all of the information and to use it, you know, I think we'll always take the bits that are salient and the bits that we can use and tangibly use going forward. But we are going to try to use as much of it as possible, I guess. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your earlier point that data has to be interpreted in order to be useful. So in order to qualify as evidence. So part of what I'm trying to do is distill what I'm finding down as much as possible to very kind of generalized principles of this is how behavioural insights can be useful. And it'll come with caveats and it'll come with whatever. But there will be a number of these that I'm hoping will be as maximally flexible as we can. That's something we will be turning to now in the next couple of months.
We've got a question from Ray Griffin. Thanks, Ray. Really interesting scheme. You're saying, can you share any insights about how you established the link and managed onboarding, nautical reference, how you managed, presumably it's induction or the process, particularly of reculturing of culture differences was part of this. So perhaps this is one for Louise about how this scheme works. Do departments advertise the scheme and then you are attracted to a project of work which has already been scoped out? And in your case, obviously, you needed to further scope it, but or do you got to establish the link first and then apply for it competitively? Maybe talk us through the process.
There are a number of different ways it can come about, but from my perspective, it was I heard of the scheme so that there were lots of different one-page project specs up there. So I had to flick through the ones that were in my area and found one that I thought, oh, this is actually something that I could consider. And there was then a sort of an open day for inquiries held in the SFI offices that I went along to and chatted to somebody from the department who hadn't written the proposal, but was at least able to give me a little bit more background about what it was most likely going to involve. And on the back of that, yeah, you put in a quite short, really, application of here's why I think I could do this. And then it went to interview and it went on and on.
And what's the lead-in time and how burdensome a process is it? And what, even, I mean, I don't know the success rate or so on, but
not burdensome by the standard of most other applications, I'll put it that way. The lead-in time for academic stuff was quite short. Maybe Therese can remind me, but it was something like deadline to apply was maybe up to July. Is it that early?
No.
Oh no, September. Okay. And then it was, yeah, November for interview. And I think I heard maybe the very start of December and then started on the 1st of February. So it was quite a tight turnaround from, oh, by the way, you have it, and now you're starting. But that suited actually at the time.
And induction, maybe just a comment on that.
Induction, I kind of had a whistle-stop tour of the department by the HR, along with another fellow who was starting at the same time, and then had whatever the department's standard induction day was about a month later, which is of limited utility really, because it's aimed at civil servants and I'm just parachuting in on a secondment. But really, it was just the sitting down with Claire and actually talking through stuff and meeting the people I would actually be working with and having a much more informal induction process, if you want to call it that. That was what was actually useful. Yeah.
And there's obviously a bit before the applications go out, which is the bit that what SFI, as it was called at the time, did with departments to come up with ideas.
So that's the bit that I'm utterly blind to.
And I think there was a fairly high success rate. But I think there was a lot of the applications got over the line. I think in one instance, SFI decided to put 2 fellows into an area where only one of it, something like that. So that it was really, this is the second go at it, and it's really only beginning to take off. And we think learning from your experiences is going to be really important for Research Ireland and its parent department to think about what we go next. But this is a really interesting example, and I think we're all intrigued by this, and it's really, really helpful that the 2 of you are here. Going to open it up to the floor, maybe for the last time. Does anybody want to come in? Anybody with any questions or comments on the floor?
Thanks, Sam. Hi, Dave Smith from Icarus here in Maynooth. There's one phrase up there which keeps singing out at me: expect changing goalposts. It's just a shame the budget never changes. But from an academic point of view, is there any way that the institution of government can learn from the academics coming into the civil service on how to manage the kind of changing goalposts, or set things out so that they're set a little bit more in stone? I appreciate events, dear boy, events. Things happen, things change, but it does seem to be quite frequent that the further you go up the chain, things come back down again and the goalposts have shifted. And is that just a function of the levels of hierarchy that you mentioned earlier, or is there anything that they can perhaps take on board from your side that might help them in their decision making?
I think you're right that it is a function of the levels of hierarchy, that there will be steers that are going to come at unexpected moments that you need to adapt to. But also the fact that because I'm coming in on a fellowship, I'm protected to a certain extent because I'm on a little island and there is this work that needs to be done and then I will go away again. So I'm bumped about in the current a little bit less than I might be if I was actually a civil servant in a department doing this kind of work. So as to whether there is something that could be learned from academia in the civil service, I think I have to hand that one to Claire.
This might ruin our relationship. Look, I think so maybe it is some function of hierarchy, and your external view, you know, that I don't necessarily have that, so I can't talk about that. From my experience, the changing goalposts is really due a lot of the time to the changing policy environment, to the changing priorities based on what's happening, based on you know, the world is always moving, and we have to try to develop policy to fit that moving world. So where you think you're going to be in a year could be completely different depending on what's happened, either in that policy area or an adjoining one that's affected it. So I think we could have had a product in this situation that we had completely determined from the outset, and you know, and Louise would have gone away and delivered that product, and it would have been exactly what we had discussed. But you have to think about impact and usefulness of it, and I think if you want the end output to be used and useful for the purpose, I think there's always going to be an element of changing, and I guess I don't know about in the academic space about whether that changes as well, and whether you need to change your research based on either the findings that you have or the changing landscape of the policy area that you're working within. I mean, I think clarity of objectives needs to be clear from the outset, and there's probably benefit in really tying down the research question at the beginning, but at the same time, I think adapting in order to promote the output and to have it be actually useful and impactful at the end. I think there's always going to be an element of changeability and flexibility in there.
I mean, like for an academic project, you'd be used to adapting as you go from kind of a bottom up. Depending on what the findings are, depending on the direction of where it's going, you will adapt. And that's happening in what I'm doing now as well, except there's also additional top-down steers.
Yeah.
And navigating between them can be interesting, but it's more of I wouldn't say it's a bigger issue for you than it is for me. If I were in your position, they would drive me insane. So I'm probably quite happy to have my little protected island of a project here.
And at the same time, there's definitely been a lot of times where I've said to Louise, like, oh, you haven't talked to anyone else in a week. Are you okay? And you're like, I'm just in the data. Like, so that would drive me crazy too.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks very much. But it's a great scheme anyway. And over the years, I'm sure it'll help improve understanding between the two disciplines, the two sides, if you like. So thank you.
Going to draw to a close now, and reflections is one of the words of the day. And Mark has a few reflections before we close.
Yeah, whether invited or not, Seán, I always jump in with a few closing reflections. Just to thank, I mean, it's two senior heavyweight people collaborating. So the insights have been really high quality and valuable, and you painted a realistic picture also of the challenges as well as the some of the opportunities and benefits. I'm still puzzled. There's a Sherlock Holmes, Miss Marple thing going on here. Who wrote this proposal? Who the hell wrote the proposal? We're going to get to the bottom of that because you've now got me upset with this now. We've got a project that's coming to fruition for somebody who wrote the proposal who's disappeared off the planet. We're really worried about that person's health and safety. So that aside, I think this is the third presentation. The first was a commission. The second was a more informal kind of opportunistic set of relationships. This is another type of brokering system, a structured exchange scheme, and learning from this type of scheme, I think, is really going to be important. I'm not sure from what we've said so far, I'm sure it is in place, but I'm not sure as yet we've banked all of the learning across the projects. And I think being able to capture that's really, really key. Some of the things you said, I think is important around succession and continuity, that this person's disappeared off, possibly in a ditch at this point somewhere, who knows. But in any case, there's even further changes since then. And I think that kind of idea of putting a structure in place is to make sure that if someone goes off ill or relationships change, it's not so bespoke to the relationship, the thing will disintegrate. But if it's a case that there's still churn within the system and maintaining projects of this sort, even in a structured environment, can be challenging, then I think that does raise this question of how dynamic even structured programs can be. The citational train that Louise, I'm like you, Louise, if you feel as if there's been a lot of work done and it's not always been documented in the past, and that didn't allow you always to do the research you wanted to do, we would be the same. Like, we learn from modules from one year to the next. I'm always going crazy as to why there's no catalogue of how modules have developed over the last 10 years. You know, at the end of each module, just put down some basic facts and we can see the trajectory. So I think that kind of broken up, fragmented or uneven back catalogue of research for policy, we can structure that, I think, a bit more systematically to capture the back story that will inform the future story. But I also think the lack of clarity in this case around the mission turned out to be a blessing in disguise. That co-creation was central to the project. And I think if you came in and worked just on a project that had been preset, that might have driven you up the wall, Louise. So as much as a dedicated research programme is nice, the open-ended nature of it, the co-creation maybe means in these schemes, the application form, which always pivots on how detailed is your work packages, and the more compelling and have you got a granular understanding of what you're doing. Maybe that's not necessarily the case. It's about how able are you to work with changing goalposts, and how flexible are your work package to evolve over time. I was taken by the cultural differences, the hierarchy and autonomy. Oh yeah, I think that's a big difference. The rhythms seem to be different also. Policy cycles, research projects, the temporalities of doing academic research and working to develop policy jar, I think, in ways which means reconciling the two can often be difficult. So that kind of understanding of the temporal rhythms of the policy cycle and the research project cycle, I think, is really important. I don't think we're always equipped to deliver research in a timely fashion to policy communities. At the same time, I think policy communities work to political cycles that don't often match on and map neatly onto the research project cycles. So more attention to that, I think, could be useful. I thought all those differences were legitimate. One of the things that I was a little bit concerned about was the different conceptions of evidence, and I understand that that's a thing on practice. Of course, we're going to have different canons through which we judge the status of different evidence trails. But if we're working to different standards of evidence, then it becomes difficult to know where the conversation's going to end. And I presume that the key thing is this policy working or is not working? Can we improve this policy? Will this improve this policy or not? And surely we can work towards common standards of evidence so that we know actually if it's evidence for policy, we must have some understanding of what evidence looks like, shared understanding of what acceptable and good evidence looks like. So that notion of there being sectoral differences in the production and the credentialising of evidence, I think, is something that threw up more questions than answers for me. Finally, I think on policy innovation, I wondered just the extent to which the project was about looking at innovative policy processes. So we do need new ways of innovating policy. Policy practice is always innovating, and as a practice, there's new ways of doing things and trying to develop policies using new methods. But the really key thing is not so much the innovation in the policy practice, it's the policy innovation. It's coming up with new solutions to problems. Whether we come up with new ways to arrive at new solutions to problems is an important question. But policy innovation processes are only valuable if they lead to meaningful policy innovation. So perhaps the focus is on policy processes that result in innovative public policies rather than fetishising innovation and policy. We could do it the old-fashioned way. If it delivers more innovative policies to tackle public problems that we can't get hold of, then the old-fashioned way is plenty fine. So I'm going to leave it at that. Many more things to say, but that was really, really great. And so thanks so much for the quality and the seniority of the work you're doing. It's very, very illuminating and lots to take hold of. So thanks for your contribution.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Just want to mention a couple of things. Well, first of all, I won't repeat anything what Mark said, but the interaction between the two of you, it was great to see the way you've got to know each other, the way you work together and the way you interact together. I think that's really, really interesting and really, really good. And the way, the partnership way in which you approached it to present, but more so when you were answering questions, because that's when you hadn't prepared. And that's really, really great. So look, we really appreciate the two of you coming, and we've learned a lot. And thanks for coming out to Maynooth, Claire, and thanks for taking a break from all that research. It's been really, really interesting. But thanks for volunteering to do it. And that's really, really good. And like, people maybe don't fully realise that Louise really is a top class researcher in the top 2% in her field and all that. So this isn't somebody who's very junior doing this. This is somebody who's very, very well established in her field, decided to take that year out from the constant research on an academic basis to do this crossover research. So it's really, 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 really good. Just want to say a couple of things. First of all, this is Research Week here, as I said at the start. Just encourage anybody in the Maynooth community to get engaged with that, and also particularly Professor Seán van Broek's inaugural lecture tomorrow afternoon at 2:00. Really, really interesting guy, and I think there's this openness to new ideas and so on. I think anybody who wants and is interested in going on to that, I think is well worth it. He's captivating, and he's really, really good. Secondly, then, to come back to this series, we've two more of these. One is on Thursday, the 14th of November, with somebody equally captivating, Brian Donlan and Chiara Loda from Department of Further Higher Education. And that's going to be a really interesting idea. And Brian is also a fellow under the SFI scheme. So I think that'll be something that's very interesting. And then on Wednesday, the 27th, we have Trevor Vaugh, who was from here, but is now in Deeper, actually in the same unit as Claire. So we're learning from his experience of working in the two communities, if you like, and from joining up the work. But look, thanks to everybody, whether online or in person, who's been here today, and we see some of you in a few weeks, and special thanks to the two of you for meeting.